A Korean crime lord quietly visited his adopted daughter's school during lunch. What he witnessed made him question everything he thought he knew about power. Min Jae-kang had survived syndicate wars and blood betrayals, but nothing prepared him for what he saw in that cafeteria. His 9-year-old daughter Nia, standing frozen while children mocked her food, her hair, her name. Teachers watching from across the room, doing nothing. He didn't step in. He observed, and in those brutal minutes, he realized something darker than any criminal conspiracy he'd ever uncovered. This wasn't random cruelty. It was routine. A daily ritual his daughter had been enduring in silence. Music. Pause. That night, he did what he does best. He investigated, buried complaints, erased incident reports, coded language designed to minimize and deflect. The school wasn't failing to protect children like Nia. It was functioning exactly as designed, keeping certain students invisible while maintaining a pristine reputation. So he came back the next week. Not as a father hoping for change. As the man whose reputation could destroy institutions with a single conversation. The question became, would exposing the truth finally protect his daughter? Or would it paint the biggest target on her back that she'd ever faced? I'd love to know. Where are you watching from? Drop your location in the comments below. And if you want to see how this unfolds, hit that subscribe button so you never miss what happens next. The autumn morning had started like any other at the Kang residence. Min Jae stood in the kitchen of their Pacific Heights home, watching his daughter through the doorway as she prepared for school. 9-year-old Nia moved through her morning routine with mechanical precision, folding her uniform blazer twice to get the creases exact, checking her backpack 3 times, counting the steps from her bedroom to the foyer. Everything had to be perfect. Everything had to be controlled. Nia ya, he called softly, using the Korean diminutive he'd adopted when she'd asked him to. Breakfast is ready. She appeared in the kitchen doorway, her dark braids pulled back so tightly they made her scalp shine. Her uniform was immaculate, every pleat of her skirt aligned, her collar buttoned to the very top despite the mild weather. Even her shoelaces were tied with identical loops on each side. "Good morning, Appa," she said quietly, bowing slightly before sliding into her chair. Min Jae studied her over his coffee. In the 2 years since he'd adopted her, he'd learned to read the small tells, the way she made herself smaller when uncertain, the careful politeness she wielded like armor. He'd seen the same survival instincts in young recruits fresh off the streets, people who'd learned that visibility meant danger. But this was supposed to be different. She was supposed to be safe now. "How did you sleep?" he asked, setting a plate of eggs and rice before her. "Very well, thank you." Her voice was barely above a whisper. She picked up her chopsticks and began separating the rice into perfect tiny portions, eating with deliberate slowness. Min Jae noticed she left half the food untouched. Again. "Not hungry?" "I'm saving room for lunch," she said, offering him a small smile that didn't reach her eyes. The same excuse she'd been using for 3 weeks. Min Jae had built an empire on reading people, on detecting lies beneath polished surfaces. He'd interrogated hardened criminals and corrupt politicians. But his daughter's quiet performances were harder to crack than any confession he'd ever extracted. She wasn't lying, exactly. She was surviving. He remembered the day he'd first met her at the children's home, the way she'd stood perfectly still while other kids ran and played, as if she'd already learned that taking up space was dangerous. The social worker had warned him. She's been through multiple placements. She'll need patience, stability, time to trust. Min Jae had promised both her and himself that she would never feel unwanted again. As he drove her to Willow Creek Academy that morning, the silence in the car felt heavier than usual. Through the rearview mirror, he watched Nia's reflection, her small hands twisted together in her lap, her gaze fixed on something beyond the rain-streaked window. The closer they got to the iron gates of the prestigious private school, the tighter her jaw became. "You know you can tell me anything," he said as they pulled into the circular drive. "Anything at all." She met his eyes in the mirror for just a moment. "I know, Appa." But she climbed out of the car with the posture of someone heading into battle. Shoulders squared, face carefully blank, each step measured and controlled. Min-jae watched her disappear through the heavy oak doors, and something cold settled in his chest. The same instinct that had kept him alive through decades in a brutal underworld was now screaming that something was very, very wrong. Throughout the day, between meetings with his legitimate business fronts and coded calls with his network, Min-jae found his mind returning to that image. Nia, squaring her shoulders like a soldier facing enemy territory. By noon, he'd made a decision. He canceled his afternoon meetings. All of them. No bodyguards, no entourage, no reputation preceding him. Just a father going to check on his daughter. The black sedan pulled up to Willow Creek Academy at 12:47 p.m., parking discreetly near the delivery entrance where no one would notice. Min-jae stepped out alone, adjusting the cuff of his tailored coat. To anyone watching, he was just another wealthy parent, perhaps a tech investor or corporate lawyer. Anonymous, unremarkable, exactly as he intended. Inside, the hallway echoed with the sounds of lunch period, children's voices bouncing off polished floors, the clatter of trays, the shuffle of expensive shoes on imported tile. Min-jae moved with the practiced invisibility of someone who'd spent a lifetime operating in shadows. He wasn't here for confrontation. He wasn't here for answers. He was here because that morning, when Nia had bowed her head over her barely touched breakfast and whispered a prayer, asking God for strength instead of happiness, something inside him had broken. And when Min-jae Kang's instincts told him to investigate, people usually ended up regretting they'd been investigated. The cafeteria doors stood ahead, institutional and cold. He pushed them open and stepped inside. What he witnessed in the next 7 minutes would change everything. The cafeteria was bright in a way that felt aggressive. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting everything in a sterile white glare that reminded Min-jae of interrogation rooms. But here, the brightness was meant to suggest safety, cleanliness, order. The kind of place where bad things weren't supposed to happen. He knew better. Min-jae stationed himself near the wall, posture relaxed, hands visible, face pleasantly blank. To anyone glancing his way, he was just another parent who'd stopped by during lunch. Maybe running late for a meeting with the principal. Maybe checking on a forgotten permission slip, but his eyes were working. He cataloged exits first. 2 main doors, 1 emergency exit partially obscured by a bulletin board, kitchen entrance with a swinging door that opened outward. Then sight lines, 3 windows overlooking the courtyard, security camera in the northeast corner, another aimed at the lunch line. Blind spots near the vending machines, and the far corner by the trash stations. Old habits. Useful habits? His gaze swept past the children and landed on the adults. 2 teachers stood near the windows, coffee cups in hand, engaged in conversation. A lunch monitor in a fluorescent vest scrolled through her phone near the condiment station. The kitchen staff worked behind their counter, efficiently plating food, eyes down. Everyone had a position. Everyone had a role. Min-jae's instincts registered something he couldn't quite name yet, a familiar organizational structure. People who knew how to see without seeing, how to be present without intervening. Then he spotted Nia. She stood in the lunch line, third from the front, holding her tray with both hands pressed flat against the plastic. Her shoulders were curved inward, making her small frame even smaller. She stared straight ahead at the back of the boy in front of her, her face carefully empty. Min-jae watched a girl behind Nia lean toward her friend, whispering something behind her hand. Both girls looked at Nia, then away, giggling softly. The line moved forward. "What is that smell?" The voice came from a boy further up, loud enough to carry but quiet enough to maintain deniability. He wrinkled his nose theatrically. "It's probably her lunch," another child responded, not bothering to lower her voice. "My mom says that food is weird." Nia's grip on her tray tightened, knuckles going pale against her dark skin. But she didn't respond, didn't turn around, didn't react at all. She'd learned not to. Min-jae's jaw clenched. He glanced toward the teachers by the window. One of them was facing the lunch line. She had to have heard. Her eyes drifted toward the commotion, lingered for a moment on Nia's rigid posture, then returned to her colleague's animated story about weekend plans. The lunch monitor never looked up from her phone. Nia reached the front of the line and accepted her meal with a quiet "thank you" that no one acknowledged. As she turned toward the seating area, a boy stepped backward without looking, bumping into her hard enough that her juice carton toppled, splashing orange liquid across her sleeve. "Oops," he said, his tone suggesting the collision was anything but accidental. "You should watch where you're going." Laughter rippled through the nearby students. Not loud, not cruel enough to draw official attention, just enough to land. Min-jae's hands curled into fists at his sides. But what struck him most wasn't the cruelty itself. He'd seen cruelty. He'd orchestrated cruelty when necessary, calibrated it like a weapon to achieve specific results. What struck him was the precision of it. This wasn't chaos. This wasn't children being thoughtlessly mean. This was controlled, rehearsed. A hierarchy being maintained through carefully measured humiliation, with adults positioned just far enough away to maintain plausible ignorance. The same way territories were controlled in his world. Through consistent, low-level enforcement that never escalated enough to attract outside intervention. Nia stood frozen in the middle of the cafeteria, her wet sleeve dripping onto the polished floor, her tray still balanced in trembling hands. She scanned the tables, searching for somewhere, anywhere, to sit. Every seat near her filled quickly. Backpacks slid onto empty chairs. Students shifted closer together, closing gaps. And Min-jae understood. This wasn't a school failing to protect his daughter. This was a system working exactly as intended, maintaining order by teaching certain children that they didn't belong, while ensuring the evidence remained invisible enough that no one would be forced to act. He'd spent 30 years operating in shadows. He recognized their architecture when he saw it. Nia moved toward the tables with the careful steps of someone navigating a minefield. Her juice-stained sleeve left a faint trail of sticky droplets on the polished floor. She approached a table where 3 girls sat with space on either end. "Excuse me?" Nia said softly. "May I?" One girl's backpack slid smoothly into the empty seat. "Sorry, my friend is sitting there." No friend appeared. Nia nodded once and moved on. At the next table, 2 boys were deep in conversation about a video game. There were 2 empty seats. She stood there for 3 seconds, waiting to be acknowledged. They never looked up. Their conversation didn't pause. But somehow, without a word spoken, their body language formed a wall she couldn't cross. She moved to the next table, then the next. Each time, the same choreography. Seats claimed by phantom occupants. Conversations that suddenly required everyone to lean in closer. Groups that unconsciously closed ranks as she approached. No one said, "You can't sit here." They didn't have to. Min-jae watched from his position by the wall, his breathing controlled, his face neutral. But inside, something ancient and violent was waking up. He'd ordered kneecappings for disrespect half this calculated. He'd had men disappeared for creating hostile territories in his operations. And here was his daughter, enduring worse, with no soldier to call, no enforcer to dispatch. The lunch monitor finally looked up from her phone, her gaze sweeping the cafeteria in a broad, unfocused arc. Her eyes passed right over Nia's isolated figure, registered nothing worth addressing, and returned to her screen. One of the teachers by the window noticed Nia still standing, tray in hand. Min-jae saw recognition flicker across her face, a brief tightening around her eyes, a barely perceptible frown. She took a sip of her coffee, glanced at her colleague, then deliberately angled her body toward the window, turning her back to the room. The message was clear. Not my problem. Not today. Nia finally made her way to the corner table, the one partially obscured by a structural pillar. The table everyone avoided because it was too far from the windows, too close to the trash stations, too obviously the place where no one wanted to be. She set her tray down with careful precision, positioning it just so. She wiped a spot on the table with her napkin, then another. She arranged her utensils parallel to each other. She unfolded her napkin and placed it in her lap. Performing normalcy. Pretending this was a choice. Min-jae had seen this before, the way people in his world made rituals out of powerlessness, how they created control in the small spaces where control was possible. A man in a cell counting cracks in concrete, a debtor arranging coins in perfect rows before paying what he owed. Nia picked up her fork and took a small bite, chewed slowly, set the fork down, took a sip of juice from the carton the bump had dented. From across the cafeteria, a voice carried, "Why does she always sit alone? Is it because—" "Shh." A giggle, whispers. Nia's hand paused halfway to her fork. For just a moment her composure cracked. Her chin trembled. Her eyes went bright with something that might have been tears. Then she locked it down, smoothed her expression, took another mechanical bite. That was when she looked up. Their eyes met across the crowded cafeteria. Min-jae saw the shock register on her face, the brief widening of her eyes, the sharp intake of breath. Then something worse than fear settled over her features. Shame. Not shame at what was being done to her, but shame that he was witnessing it. She held his gaze for one endless second. Then, barely perceptibly, she shook her head. Don't. The command was silent, but absolute. Don't come over. Don't make a scene. Don't make this worse. Don't make me more visible than I already am. Min-jae's feet rooted to the floor. His daughter wasn't asking him to save her. She was asking him to let her survive this the only way she knew how. By becoming invisible. By enduring. By not making waves that would drown her when he left. She'd learned that visibility meant danger. And she'd learned it not in his world of calculated violence, but here, in this place of polished floors and bright lights and zero-tolerance policies printed in glossy handbooks. Nia returned to her lunch. She managed 3 more bites before gently pushing the tray away. She sat perfectly still for the remaining minutes of lunch period, hands folded in her lap, staring at nothing. When the bell rang, she stood, gathered her barely touched meal, and walked to the trash station. The food slid off the tray with quiet efficiency. The sandwich she'd asked for that morning, the fruit she loved, the crackers he'd packed specially. All of it disappeared into the bin. She stacked her tray neatly with the others and walked toward the exit, her back straight, her pace measured. She never looked at him again. Min-jae stood alone against the wall as the cafeteria emptied, the fluorescent lights humming above him, and felt something he hadn't experienced in 30 years. Not rage, shame. He commanded men. He controlled territory. He'd built an empire where his word was law and his protection was absolute. And he couldn't protect his daughter from a cafeteria full of children. The worst part wasn't that he'd witnessed her humiliation. It was that she'd had to witness his helplessness. Min-jae sat in his study long after Nia had gone to bed, the city lights of San Francisco glittering through the floor-to-ceiling windows behind him. His laptop screen cast a pale glow across his face as his fingers moved across the keyboard with practiced efficiency. He'd returned to an empty house after leaving the school. Nia had come home on the bus as usual, completed her homework with meticulous silence, eaten half her dinner, and gone to bed early. She'd said nothing about his appearance at school. Neither had he. But now, alone in the dark, Min-jae did what he'd always done when facing an enemy he didn't fully understand. He gathered intelligence. His access to Willow Creek Academy's parent portal gave him the surface level. Attendance records, lunch account balances, upcoming events. But Min-jae hadn't built an empire by accepting surface-level information. Within 20 minutes, he'd navigated into the school's internal communication systems, the kind of access that required knowing which digital doors to open and which passwords were stored in predictable patterns. He wasn't proud of it, but he wasn't apologetic either. The first email thread he found was dated 3 weeks ago. Subject line: Nia Kang, Social Integration Concerns. Mrs. Patterson, I've noticed Nia continues to struggle with peer relationships during unstructured time. Perhaps we could schedule a check-in to discuss strategies for helping her adjust to our school culture. Ms. Chen, School Counselor. Adjust to our school culture. Not address the treatment she's receiving. Not intervene in the isolation we're observing. Adjust. Min-jae clicked through to the next message. Thank you for flagging this. I agree Nia shows some sensitivity around group dynamics. I'll monitor the situation and reach out to Mr. Kang if we feel additional support is warranted. Mrs. Patterson, 4th grade teacher sensitivity. As if the problem originated with Nia's reaction rather than the actions she was reacting to. He opened another file. Incident reports from the past 2 months. A complaint filed by Nia herself 6 weeks ago, written in her careful, too neat handwriting. Some students said my lunch smelled bad and laughed when I sat down. I felt sad. The response, logged 3 days later. Spoke with students involved, explained importance of respectful language, encouraged Nia to understand that children sometimes make observations without ill intent, reminded her that cultural differences can lead to misunderstandings. No further action needed. Cultural misunderstandings. Min-jae's jaw tightened. He'd heard similar language before, in legitimate business meetings where his Korean background was treated as a curiosity, an obstacle, something to be managed. He'd learned to navigate those spaces by becoming exactly what they expected. Quiet, unassuming, easy to overlook. Until he wasn't. Another report, another incident, more coded language, social adjustment difficulties, emotional regulation concerns, reluctance to advocate for herself. Never once did the word bullying appear. Never once was another child named as responsible. The pattern was surgical in its precision. Each report documented Nia's struggles while carefully avoiding any language that would require institutional accountability. The problem wasn't the environment. The problem was Nia's inability to adapt to it. Down the hall, he could hear the faint sound of Nia's bedroom door opening, then closing. bathroom run. He listened to the soft pad of her feet, the running water, the toilet flush, the careful quietness of a child who'd learned not to disturb. Min-jae returned to his screen. He found a staff meeting memo from last month. Reminder: when documenting student concerns, please use objective, non-inflammatory language. Focus on observable behaviors rather than interpretations. Avoid terminology that could create legal exposure for the district. There it was. Not a conspiracy. Not malice. Just a system optimized to protect itself, where every policy, every procedure, every carefully chosen word was designed to create plausible deniability. He'd seen the same structure in corrupt organizations, not evil people making evil choices, but ordinary people following protocols that produced evil outcomes. Nobody gave the order to harm Nia. They just created the conditions where harming her had no consequences. In the kitchen, he heard Nia's careful footsteps again. Back to her room. The soft click of her door. Min-jae could have her out of Willow Creek by Monday. One phone call. He had connections at a dozen private schools across the Bay Area, places with smaller class sizes, stricter supervision, zero-tolerance policies that might actually mean something. He could move her somewhere safer, somewhere private, somewhere untouchable. His hand hovered over his phone, his private contact list glowing on the screen. Then he remembered her voice in the hallway last time, when she'd overheard him researching new schools. If I leave, they win, and they'll just do it to someone else. His daughter, 9 years old, already understanding what he'd spent 3 decades learning in a much darker context. That running from a corrupt system didn't fix it. It just passed the violence to the next person. Min-jae closed his laptop and sat in the darkness, listening to the silence of his house. He'd survived by knowing when to fight and when to disappear. But Nia had just taught him something he'd forgotten. Some battles, you fight not because you can win, but because someone has to. The question was no longer whether to act. The question was how to dismantle a system that had made invisibility a survival skill, without making his daughter more visible than she could survive. The following evening, Min-jae made the call. He stood in his study with the door half closed, phone pressed to his ear, speaking in the low, measured tones he reserved for business that required discretion. "Kenneth, it's Min-jae Kang. I need a favor." A pause. "My daughter. I'm looking at a mid-year transfer to Laurelhurst Academy." "Yes, I understand the waiting list." "That's why I'm calling you." Kenneth Cho owed him 3 favors from a real estate deal that had saved his commercial properties from foreclosure. This would make it 2. 9th grade curriculum, advanced placement track, full security protocols. I want her in a classroom where every adult is watching, every incident is documented, He stopped. "Yes. Monday enrollment, if possible." He was finalizing the logistics, tuition payment, transcript transfer, uniform measurements, when he sensed the shift in air pressure that meant he wasn't alone. Min-jae turned. Nia stood in the hallway, still in her pajamas, one hand gripping the doorframe. Her face had gone carefully blank, but her eyes were too bright. "Nia ya," he said quietly, lowering the phone. "Go back to bed, sweetheart." "You're sending me away." Her voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried the weight of a verdict. "I'm moving you somewhere safer." "You're sending me away." Louder now, something cracking beneath the words. Min-jae ended the call without saying goodbye. He set the phone down and approached her slowly, the way he'd approach anything fragile and capable of shattering. "It's not like that. Laurelhurst Academy has better programs, smaller classes. You'll have... I don't want another new school." The words came out sharp, almost angry. I don't want to start over again. Again? The word stopped him. Nia's hands were trembling now, fingers white against the doorframe. Do you know how many schools I've been to? Do you? Her voice rose, all the careful control she maintained every day finally breaking. 5. 5 schools before you adopted me, and you know what happened at every single one? Min-jae felt something cold settle in his stomach. The same thing. Nia's chin lifted, defiant even as tears started tracking down her face. New school, new faces, same whispers, same looks, same seats that are suddenly taken when I try to sit down. She swiped at her eyes with the back of her hand. It doesn't matter where I go. I bring it with me. That's not... Min-jae started, but she cut him off. Yes, it is. She stepped forward, small and fierce. And running away won't fix it. It just means someone else takes my place. Some other kid who eats different food, or talks different, or looks different. They'll just do it to them instead. Min-jae knelt in front of her, his dangerous world suddenly meaningless. All his power, all his carefully built empire, all the fear his name carried in certain circles, none of it mattered here. You don't have to fight this, he said, his voice rough. You're 9 years old. You shouldn't have to, but I do. Nia's voice broke, but she didn't look away. Because if I don't, who will? You can move me to a fancy school with guards and gates, and I'll be safe. But what about the girl who sits alone tomorrow? What about the kid they pick next? She was crying openly now, but her gaze remained steady. I don't want to disappear again, Appa. I've been disappearing my whole life. Different homes, different families, different schools. Always trying to be smaller, quieter, less trouble. And you know what? I'm so tired of disappearing. Min-jae pulled her into his arms, feeling her small frame shake against his chest. He'd held dying men who'd shown less courage than this. He'd faced down syndicate bosses with less resolve. Every time I moved before, she whispered against his shoulder, I told myself the next place would be different. That maybe if I was perfect enough, quiet enough, good enough, they'd let me stay. But it's never enough, is it? No, Min-jae said quietly. It's never enough. Because the problem was never her. Nia pulled back, wiping her face with her pajama sleeve. So, if I'm going to fight anyway, I want to fight here. Where at least one person... Her voice wavered. At least one person can see me. Min-jae cupped her face in his hands. This child who'd survived more than most adults, who'd learned lessons about power and invisibility that had taken him decades to understand. Okay, he said finally. Okay? We don't run. He brushed tears from her cheeks with his thumbs. We fight. How? Min-jae thought about the emails, the carefully coded language, the system designed to protect itself. He thought about all the times he'd dismantled corrupt organizations, exposed institutional rot, forced accountability where none existed. The same way I've always fought, he said, by making sure people can't look away anymore. Nia studied his face, searching for something. Will it work? I don't know, Min-jae admitted. But your way, staying visible, refusing to disappear, that takes more courage than anything I've ever done. She nodded once, decisive despite the tears still wet on her face. That night, after tucking Nia back into bed, Min-jae returned to his study. He opened his laptop and began typing, not to Kenneth Cho about transfers, but to the Willow Creek Academy administration. Subject line, request for district meeting. Urgent matter requiring public discussion. He wasn't pulling his daughter out. He was pulling the whole system into the light. Min-jae arrived at Willow Creek Academy the following Tuesday at 9 a.m. sharp. This time, he didn't park by the delivery entrance. He pulled into the visitor spot directly in front of the main entrance, where everyone could see. He wore the same tailored suit he'd worn to a city council meeting last month. The one where 3 politicians had quietly revised their positions on a zoning proposal after learning his name. He walked through the front doors without hesitation, his footsteps echoing on marble floors. The administrative assistant looked up from her desk, her practiced smile already forming. "Good morning. How can I—" She stopped. Recognition flickered across her face, followed by something that might have been nervousness. "Mr. Kang? I wasn't expecting—" "I sent an email requesting a district meeting," Min-jae said calmly. "I'm here to confirm the arrangements." "Oh, yes. Principal Morrison wanted to speak with you first about—" "The meeting will be public," Min-jae continued, as if she hadn't spoken. "Parents, administrators, board members. I'd like it documented and recorded. The district office has a community room that should accommodate everyone." The assistant's fingers hovered over her keyboard. "I'm not sure we can arrange something of that scale on such short—" "Friday evening, 6 o'clock. Min-jae placed a business card on her desk. "My assistant will handle logistics if your office needs support." She stared at the card. Everyone in San Francisco who needed to know knew the name printed there, and those who didn't know were about to learn. By lunch, whispers had started circulating through the parent pickup line. "Did you hear Kang requested a meeting?" "The Kang? The one who— What's it about?" "Something about his daughter." Min-jae heard the conversations from where he stood near the courtyard, watching parents cluster in small groups. Some glanced his direction with poorly concealed curiosity. Others avoided looking at him entirely, suddenly very interested in their phones. A woman approached him hesitantly. Andrea Martinez, he recognized her from parent orientation. Her son was in Nia's class. "Mr. Kang?" She stopped a respectful distance away. "I heard about the meeting. Is it about what I think it's about?" Min-jae studied her. "What do you think it's about?" She glanced around, lowering her voice. "My son came home 2 weeks ago upset because he tried to sit with Nia at lunch. Some older kids told him he shouldn't. When I emailed the teacher about it—" She trailed off. "I got a very polite response about how children need to learn to navigate social dynamics independently." "Do you believe that?" Min-jae asked. "No." Her voice was firm now. "I believe they told my son that standing up for someone comes with consequences, and he's 9. He shouldn't have to learn that lesson yet." By Thursday, more parents had reached out. A father whose daughter had been mocked for her accent. A mother whose son's traditional lunch had been called gross so many times he now refused to bring anything but sandwiches. Another parent whose child had been systematically excluded from group projects until she'd begged to switch classes. Each story followed the same pattern. Complaints filed, polite acknowledgments received, no action taken. "They told me my daughter was overly sensitive," one mother said during a phone call Min-jae hadn't expected. "That she needed to develop resilience, as if being resilient means accepting cruelty as normal." The meeting room at the district office filled 15 minutes early. Parents lined the walls when the chairs ran out. Min-jae had expected maybe 30 people. 67 showed up. The school board members sat at a long table at the front, their expressions ranging from professional concern to barely concealed irritation. Principal Morrison sat at the end, his hands folded carefully on the table. Min-jae didn't take a seat. He stood at the back, watching as parents began to speak. A father stood first, voice shaking. My daughter stopped eating lunch 6 months ago. When I asked why, she said it was easier than explaining her food to people who'd already decided it was wrong. Another parent. The counselor told me my son needed to learn not to stand out so much. He's 10. How is existing standing out? Then a mother Min-jae hadn't met. My daughter transferred out last year. I thought moving her was protecting her, but I just left the problem for the next family. The stories spilled out, one after another. Each one a small violence, each one carefully documented and professionally dismissed. 40 minutes in, movement caught Min-jae's attention. A teacher stood in the back corner. Miss Chen, the counselor whose emails he'd read. Her hands were clasped tightly in front of her, and her face had gone pale. The room quieted as people noticed her. I saw it, she said, her voice barely steady. I saw what was happening. To Nia, to others. She looked at Min-jae, then at the board members. And I said nothing. I told myself I was following protocol, that it wasn't my place to intervene without clear evidence of targeted harassment, that I needed to protect myself from liability. Her voice broke. But the truth is, I was protecting the institution, not the children. She took a shaky breath. I knew the language to use in my reports that would document the problem without requiring action. I knew how to make it sound like a sensitivity issue instead of a safety issue. And I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. The room remained silent. Min-jae watched her, this woman who'd found the courage to admit what the system had made her become. Thank you, he said quietly, and meant it. After Ms. Chen sat down, the room held its breath. Board President Eleanor Hartwell leaned forward, her expression carefully composed. We appreciate everyone coming forward with their concerns. The district takes all reports of student welfare seriously, and will be reviewing. With respect, Mrs. Hartwell, Min-jae said, his voice cutting cleanly through her prepared statement. We've all heard reviews promised before. Heads turned. He stepped forward from the back of the room, and the crowd parted. My name is Kang Min-jae. Some of you know my reputation in this city. Some of you have heard stories. He paused, letting the weight of that settle. I come from a world where silence keeps you alive, where seeing too much, saying too much, can get you disappeared. A few parents shifted uncomfortably. The board members' professional masks flickered. In my world, we call it survival. We justify it because the alternative is death. Min-jae's gaze swept the room. But I've spent this week reading your emails, your incident reports, your carefully worded documentation, and I've realized something. You've built the same system here. Different stakes, same structure, silence as protection, deniability as policy. Principal Morrison cleared his throat. Mr. Kang, I understand you're upset, but to compare a school to what? Min-jae's voice remained calm, but something sharp entered it. To an organization that prioritizes its own survival over the people it's supposed to protect? That creates language designed to obscure rather than illuminate? That punishes visibility and rewards compliance? He turned to face the parents. The difference is, in my world, everyone knows the danger. No one pretends the violence isn't real. But here, you've wrapped it in bright colors and zero-tolerance policies and inclusivity statements. You've made it look like safety while teaching children that cruelty is just social dynamics they need to navigate alone. Movement at the back, a man with a camera. Min-jae recognized the press badge, the Chronicle. Someone had tipped them off. Good. Board member David Chen, no relation to the counselor, looked distinctly uncomfortable. If there have been oversights in our response protocols, we can certainly... Oversights? A mother stood, her voice shaking with controlled fury. My daughter documented 17 separate incidents. 17. Each one was reviewed, acknowledged, and filed away. That's not an oversight. That's a system working exactly as designed. The policy clearly states, Hartwell began. Your policies are designed to protect you, another father interrupted. Not our children. The board members exchanged glances. Hartwell straightened her papers, a tell Min-jae recognized, someone preparing to shut down a conversation that had gotten out of control. I think we should table this discussion until... No. Min-jae's single word stopped her. You don't get to table this, not anymore. He pulled out his phone, pulled up a document, and turned the screen toward the room. This is a formal complaint filed with the State Education Department. Systematic failure to address harassment based on race, ethnicity, and cultural background. Retaliation against students who report incidents. Creation of a hostile educational environment through institutional negligence. Hartwell's face went pale. You filed with the state? This morning, before this meeting. Min-jae pocketed his phone. I'm also prepared to file civil complaints on behalf of every family in this room who wants to join the action. And given the media presence... He nodded toward the reporter, whose pen was flying across his notepad. I suspect other families will be reaching out soon. This is highly irregular. Morrison started. So is telling a 9-year-old that her isolation is a cultural misunderstanding. Min-jae said quietly. So is teaching children that reporting cruelty makes them overly sensitive. So is building a system where adults profit from maintaining order at the expense of protecting the vulnerable. The room erupted. Parents calling out agreement, board members trying to regain control, the reporter's camera flashing. Through the chaos, Min-jae found Miss Chen in the crowd. She met his eyes and nodded once. Gratitude, or maybe solidarity. Hartwell slammed her gavel. Order. We will have order. When the room finally quieted, she looked directly at Min-jae. What exactly do you want? A formal investigation, independent oversight, policy revision that prioritizes intervention over documentation, mandatory training for all staff on recognizing and addressing systemic bias, and accountability, real accountability, when adults fail to protect children in their care. That would require district-wide restructuring, then restructure. A long silence. Finally, Hartwell exchanged glances with the other board members. A whispered consultation. Then, we'll convene an emergency session to discuss forming an investigation committee. We'll need time to... You have until Monday to announce the investigation publicly, Min-jae said, or the civil complaints move forward immediately. Hartwell's jaw tightened, but she nodded. This meeting is adjourned. Outside in the parking lot, Min-jae leaned against his car, the adrenaline finally catching up to him. Parents stopped to shake his hand, thank him, share their phone numbers. The reporter tried for a quote, but Min-jae declined politely. His phone buzzed. A text from his sister, who'd stayed home with Nia. She's asleep. How did it go? Min-jae stared at the message, trying to formulate an answer. He'd forced the system into the light, demanded accountability, made it impossible for them to look away. But Nia still had to walk into that school on Monday, and everyone would know her father was the man who'd blown everything open. He typed back, Not sure yet. We'll know Monday. He'd won the battle tonight, but the war was just beginning, and his daughter was still on the front line. Monday morning arrived with gray skies and a silence in the car that felt different from before. Min-jae watched Nia in the rearview mirror as they approached Willow Creek Academy. Her uniform was perfect as always, but her hands twisted in her lap with new intensity. "You don't have to go in today," he offered quietly. I have to go in eventually." Nia's voice was steady, but small. "Might as well be today." The parent drop-off line felt different. Some parents waved at Min-jae, solidarity or maybe gratitude. Others looked away quickly, suddenly fascinated by their phones. One mother pulled her car forward without acknowledging him at all, though he'd seen her at the meeting Friday night. As Nia climbed out, Min-jae caught her hand. "Text me if you need anything. I'll be 10 minutes away." She nodded, squared her shoulders, and walked toward the entrance. He'd never hated watching her walk away more than he did in that moment. By Tuesday, the backlash had begun in earnest. An email appeared in Min-jae's inbox from a parents' group he hadn't known existed. "While we appreciate your concern for your daughter, some of us feel your approach was unnecessarily aggressive and has created a hostile environment for staff who are doing their best under difficult circumstances." Unnecessarily aggressive. As if 30 documented incidents dismissed over 6 months was somehow insufficient grounds for action. Another parent cornered him at pickup. "My daughter's teacher is one of the ones suspended. She's terrified. She has a mortgage, student loans. Was it really necessary to go after individual teachers like that?" Min-jae kept his voice level. "I didn't go after anyone. I requested accountability for systematic failures." "It's the same thing to them," the parent said, walking away. Wednesday brought news that Principal Morrison had been placed on administrative leave pending the investigation. Some parents celebrated. Others whispered that Min-jae had destroyed a good man's career over his daughter's adjustment issues. The divide was clean and brutal. Families who'd experienced the system's failures versus families who'd never had to. Thursday, Nia came home with her homework folder slightly crumpled, unusual for her. When Min-jae asked about it, she shrugged. "Someone bumped into me in the hallway. It's fine." "Was it an accident? Does it matter?" Her voice was tired. "Everyone's looking at me now, Appa. Before, they ignored me. Now they stare. I don't know which is worse." Min-jae felt something twist in his chest. "Do you want me to?" "No?" She looked up at him. "You did what I asked. I didn't think it would feel like this." That night, Min-jae sat in his study, staring at the district's official statement. The Board of Education has formed an independent oversight committee to review student welfare policies and procedures. Initial findings will be presented in 60 days. 60 days. 2 months of Nia walking through halls where everyone knew her father had blown up the system. 2 months of teachers walking on eggshells, resentful of oversight. 2 months of parents dividing into camps, their children absorbing that division. He'd wanted to protect her. Instead, he'd made her the most visible target in the building. His phone buzzed. A text from Ms. Chen. 3 staff members quit today. 2 more threatening legal action. Just thought you should know what's happening." Min-jae closed his eyes. In his world, when you dismantled a corrupt system, collateral damage was expected, calculated, sometimes necessary. But this wasn't his world, and the collateral was children watching adults fight battles they shouldn't have to witness. Friday, Min-jae picked Nia up early, citing a dentist appointment that didn't exist. They went for ice cream instead, her favorite place overlooking the bay. "I'm sorry," he said finally, watching her stir melted chocolate with her spoon. "For what?" "For making things harder." Nia was quiet for a long moment. "Do you remember what you told me? About how in your world people stay quiet to stay alive?" Min-jae nodded. "I was already quiet, Appa. I was already invisible, At least now. She paused, searching for words. At least now people know something's wrong, even if they're angry about it, even if it's messy. At least it's not secret anymore. That doesn't make the mess easier to live in. No, she agreed. But maybe that's the point. Maybe it's supposed to be hard. Otherwise, nothing changes. Min-jae studied his 9-year-old daughter, wondering when she'd become wise enough to understand what he was still struggling to accept. The following Monday, 3 weeks after the district meeting, Min-jae made his usual unannounced visit to the cafeteria. He stood in his spot by the wall, watching. Nia moved through the lunch line, tray in hand. The whispers were still there. He could see them in the way some children leaned together, glancing her direction. But when she reached the seating area, something different happened. A girl with red hair at the center table looked up. Nia? She gestured to an empty seat. Do you want to sit here? Nia froze. The girl smiled, uncertain but genuine. I'm Maya. We're in the same reading group. For 3 long seconds, Nia didn't move. Then she walked over and sat down. She set her tray carefully on the table, smoothed her napkin, picked up her fork, and took a bite. Maya said something Min-jae couldn't hear. Nia actually responded, not just nodded. Another girl at the table joined the conversation. It wasn't triumphant. It wasn't a transformation. But Nia's shoulders weren't tucked inward. Her hands weren't trembling. And when she reached for her sandwich, she took a full bite instead of a careful nibble. Min-jae watched his daughter eat lunch at a table with other children and felt something loosen in his chest. The system hadn't changed yet. The investigation was ongoing. Staff were angry. Parents were divided. The backlash was real and would continue. But Nia was eating. And someone had asked her to sit down. It wasn't victory, but it was something. 6 weeks later, Min-jae sat in his car across from Willow Creek Academy, engine off, watching the courtyard through the iron gates. It had become a ritual he hadn't planned on keeping, this quiet surveillance from a distance. Not every day, just the days when his instincts told him to check. The days when the weight of what he'd set in motion felt heavier than usual. The Oversight Committee had released its preliminary findings. 17 policy changes recommended, mandatory bias training implemented, 2 administrators reassigned, 3 teachers on probation. The local news had covered it for a week, then moved on to other stories. But the real changes, the ones that mattered, were harder to measure, harder to document. The kind that happened in cafeterias and hallways, in the small moments between bells. Through the windshield, Min-jae watched students pour out for lunch period. The familiar chaos of voices and movement. The social choreography he'd learned to read like a map of territorial boundaries. Then he saw her. Nia emerged from the double doors, her backpack bouncing against her shoulders. Her braids were different today. Looser, with colorful beads she'd chosen herself last weekend. She'd asked for them specifically. Asked, not defaulted to what was safest. She walked toward the cafeteria with Maya, the red-haired girl who'd first invited her to sit. They were talking, actually talking, with hand gestures and expressions that suggested a real conversation, not the careful politeness Nia used to wield like armor. Min-jae's chest tightened. Inside the cafeteria, he'd positioned himself where he could see through the windows. Nia moved through the lunch line. No bumps? No spills? When a boy cut in front of her accidentally, he apologized. She smiled and said something that made him laugh. Small things, unremarkable to anyone else, extraordinary to him. She reached the seating area, tray balanced on her hands. For a moment, Min-jae saw the old hesitation, the scanning for safe spaces, the calculation of risk. Old habits didn't disappear just because policies changed. Then Maya waved from a table near the windows. Not the corner table. Not the isolated spot by the trash cans. The middle of the room, where sunlight streamed through glass, and conversations overlapped in the kind of comfortable chaos that meant belonging. Nia walked over without counting steps, without rehearsing what to say, without making herself smaller. She sat down, set her tray on the table without wiping it first, opened her lunch container, the kimchi fried rice he'd made that morning, and took a bite. No one wrinkled their nose. No one made comments. A boy across the table asked what it was, genuine curiosity in his voice. Nia explained, and he asked if he could try some. She shared. Min-jae watched his daughter laugh at something Maya said, her head thrown back, completely unguarded. Watched her take another bite of rice without checking who was watching. Watched her reach for her juice without the careful deliberation that used to mark every movement. She was eating, really eating, not performing, not surviving, just being. 40 minutes later, when the bell rang, Nia stood with the others. She gathered her things, but her tray was different from the ones Min-jae had seen her carry before. Empty. She'd finished everything. That evening, Min-jae stood at the kitchen counter, preparing dinner. Nia sat at the table doing homework, humming something under her breath, a song he didn't recognize, probably from school. "Appa?" she said without looking up from her math problems. Thank you." Min-jae set down the knife he'd been using to cut vegetables. "For what?" "For not letting me disappear." She looked up then, her eyes clear. "Even when I asked you to." He crossed to her, kneeling beside her chair the way he had that night weeks ago, when she'd stood in his doorway afraid of being sent away. "You taught me something," he said quietly. "I spent 30 years learning that fear keeps you alive, that invisibility is safety, that the most dangerous thing you can do is be seen." "But," Nia prompted, a small smile on her face. "But you showed me that some things are worth being seen for. That visibility isn't always danger." He touched her cheek gently. "That sometimes the bravest thing you can do is refuse to disappear." Nia leaned into his hand. Was it worth it? Everything that happened? Min-jae thought about the backlash, the division, the staff who'd lost positions, the parents who still wouldn't meet his eyes at pickup. He thought about the oversight committees and policy changes that would take years to fully implement. The slow, grinding work of institutional change that never felt like enough. Then he thought about his daughter eating lunch with friends, laughing, sharing her food without fear. "Yes," he said, "it was worth it." Later that night, after Nia had gone to bed, Min-jae stood at his study window overlooking the city. The lights stretched out before him. Territories he'd once controlled through fear and calculated moves. Through the kind of power that made people look away. He'd built an empire on that power. But his 9-year-old daughter had taught him something his empire never could. True power wasn't about making people afraid to see you. True power was refusing to let anyone, including yourself, disappear. And that kind of power, that changed everything. Thanks so much, my dear friends, for enjoying this beautiful story till this end. If you've not subscribed, kindly subscribe now to be notified when we drop our next story. Also, like the video and comment where you are watching from and what time it's at your end. Thank you.